In a dusty Montana auction barn, a scarred German shepherd lay waiting to die, discarded by the military that once called him a hero. But when a broken soldier named Mason Carter stood up and said, "I'll take him," no one knew it would spark a journey of healing, secrets, and a fight neither could face alone. This is their story. The Lincoln County auction barn sat just beyond the outskirts of Missoula, Montana, a weathered relic hunched beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and stale coffee, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pause, a quiet limbo where old farm tools, dented furniture, and forgotten lives changed hands. But on this cold February afternoon in 2005, something different lay at the heart of the concrete floor. A German shepherd, motionless, his scarred body stretched out like a shadow that had given up chasing the light. His fur, once sleek and commanding, was matted and dull, clinging to a frame so thin you could trace the ridges of his ribs. Scars crisscrossed his sides, jagged lines that told a story no one in the room dared to ask aloud. This wasn't just any dog. His broad shoulders and steady paws hinted at a past of purpose, of pride. He'd been a soldier once, a military canine trained to face chaos and come out the other side. Now, though, his head rested flat against the ground, his dark eyes staring at nothing, as if the weight of what he'd endured had finally pinned him down. Around him, the crowd murmured, a mix of ranchers in worn boots, bargain hunters with sharp eyes, and a few curious locals with nothing better to do. Their voices bounced off the tin walls, a low hum of judgment and indifference. "Not worth a penny," a grizzled man in a flannel shirt muttered, spitting tobacco into a cup. "Broken beyond repair," another voice chimed in, sharp and dismissive, from a woman clutching a clipboard near the front. Sneers rippled through the room, a cruel soundtrack to the dog's stillness. He didn't flinch, didn't even lift his head, as if he'd heard it all before and learned it was safer to stay down. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Hank, with a voice roughened by years of shouting over crowds, stepped forward. His hands fidgeted with the gavel, betraying a flicker of unease. He'd seen plenty come through this barn, horses too old to ride, machinery rusted beyond use. But this felt different. "All right, folks," he croaked, his tone cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. "We've got a former military dog here, starting bid at $50. Any takers?" The words hung in the air, fragile and unanswered. A few chuckles broke out, cold and hollow, spreading like a shiver through the room. $50 for a living ghost? It was a joke to them. The German shepherd's ears twitched, a faint sign of life, but his body stayed rooted to the floor. The laughter grew louder, a wave of mockery crashing over him. To these people, he was damaged goods, a relic of war with no fight left, a burden no one sane would take on. Hank's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting to the dog, as if silently pleading for someone, anyone, to see past the scars. But the crowd's disdain was a wall, and it seemed like the gavel would fall on an empty bid. Then, from the back of the room, came a sound that cut through the noise like a blade, the scrape of a chair against the chipped wooden floor. Heads turned, the laughter faltering as a figure stood up. He was young, maybe mid-30s, with a lean frame wrapped in a faded army jacket, the kind that had seen too many winters. His face was half hidden in the shadow of a worn baseball cap, but his jaw was set, and his eyes, though distant, burned with something fierce. The room went quiet, the air tightening as he stepped forward, his boots thudding softly against the floor. "I'll take him," he said. His voice was steady, low, but it carried a weight that silenced the last whispers of scorn. There was a haunt in his tone, an echo of battles fought far from this dusty barn, but it held no room for doubt. The crowd stared, caught off guard. Who was this guy? Some muttered under their breath, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged him. Hank blinked, gripping the gavel tighter. "Sold," he stammered, almost too quickly, as if afraid the offer might vanish. $50 to the man in the back. The German shepherd's head lifted, just an inch, barely noticeable, but his eyes found the stranger. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in those dull depths, a spark of recognition, or maybe just curiosity. The man didn't move closer, didn't rush to claim his prize. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the dog as if they were the only two souls in the room. The crowd dispersed, grumbling or shrugging it off, already moving on to the next lot, a rusted tractor or a box of chipped dishes. But for the man and the dog, this was no ordinary transaction. It was a beginning. No one knew it then, not Hank, not the jeering bidders, not even the man himself. But this moment would unravel a story bigger than any of them could imagine. A story of pain, yes, but also of healing. Of two broken warriors finding their way back to the light. His name was Mason Carter, and as he locked eyes with the dog he'd just claimed, something shifted in the universe. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a lifeline, thrown across species, across time, into a future neither could yet see. Mason Carter wasn't always a man of few words. There was a time when his laugh could fill a room, when his hazel eyes lit up with plans for a life beyond the rolling hills of Montana. But that was before the army, before the desert sands of Afghanistan swallowed pieces of him he'd never get back. Now, at 34, he carried the weight of those years in the lines etched across his forehead, and the calluses roughening his hands. 3 years had passed since his boots last crunched the gravel of a forward operating base, but the war hadn't let him go. It lingered in the way he flinched at a car backfiring down the road, in the cold sweats that jolted him awake before dawn, haunted by faces he couldn't save. He'd come home to a small ranch just outside Missoula, a patch of earth his grandfather had left him when the old man passed a decade ago. It wasn't much, a weathered house with chipped paint, a barn leaning slightly to one side, and a few acres of grassland stretching toward the mountains. But it was his. The horses his grandfather had loved, 3 of them now, grazed quietly in the pasture, their steady breathing a rhythm Mason clung to. The ranch was his sanctuary, a place where the world's noise dulled to a hum, but it was also his prison. The walls seemed to close in at night, echoing with memories he couldn't outrun. His days followed a pattern carved deep into muscle memory. At first light, he'd brew a pot of coffee, black, no sugar, on a stove that creaked with age. He'd sip it on the porch, watching the sky shift from pink to gold, the steam curling into the crisp Montana air. Then he'd tend to the horses, brushing their coats, checking their hooves, murmuring to them in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. The rest of the hours blurred into chores, fixing fences, hauling hay, fighting the silence with the clink of tools. But the memories didn't care about routine. They'd creep in uninvited. The crack of gunfire, the smell of burning diesel, the weight of a friend's lifeless arm across his shoulder. He'd push them back, jaw tight, until the next one came. The local VA office tried to reach him. Their calls came like clockwork, a cheerful voice on the answering machine offering appointments, support groups, a chance to talk it out. Mason never picked up. The phone would blink red for days before he erased the messages, their words dissolving into static. In the bathroom cabinet, a row of pill bottles gathered dust, prescribed for sleep, for anxiety, for the invisible wounds the doctors swore they could fix. He'd tried them once, months after coming home. They dulled the edges but left him hollow, a stranger in his own skin. So they stayed there, untouched, a silent rebellion against a system that didn't understand. That morning, February 25th, 2005, started like any other. Coffee in hand, he'd flipped through the Missoula Gazette, its pages thin and crinkled from the wind. He wasn't looking for anything special, just skimming the classifieds out of habit, farm equipment for sale, a lost cat notice, the usual small-town chatter. Then his eyes caught on 6 lines of text tucked near the bottom. Former military dog, aggressive, no training potential, final auction at Lincoln County barn today before euthanasia. His mug froze halfway to his lips. The words hit him like a punch, sharp, sudden, pulling at something buried deep. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from a rage he hadn't felt since Kandahar, when he'd watched good men die and better promises break. Mason knew military dogs. He'd served alongside them, seen them sniff out danger, take down threats, stand steady when soldiers faltered. They weren't just animals. They were brothers in arms, trained to protect, to sacrifice. The idea of one being sold off like scrap metal, labeled aggressive and doomed to die, twisted something fierce in his chest. He thought of his own scars, the ones no one saw, and the labels he'd dodged, unstable, damaged, unfit. The paper crumpled in his grip as he stared at the ad, the ink smudging under his thumb. He hadn't planned to leave the ranch that day. The horses needed feed. The fence by the creek was sagging, and the solitude was safe. But this was different. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, the jangle loud in the quiet house. His faded army jacket hung there too, patched at the elbows, a relic of a life he'd tried to leave behind. Slipping it on, he felt its weight settle over his shoulders like armor. The drive to the Lincoln County auction barn was a blur, pine trees flashing past, the hum of the truck's engine drowning out the noise in his head. He didn't know what he'd do when he got there, didn't have a plan beyond showing up. But as the barn came into view, squat and unassuming against the gray sky, he felt it. A pull, a whisper of purpose he hadn't heard in years. Mason parked near the back, the gravel crunching under his tires, and stepped out into the chill. The crowd's murmur drifted through the open doors, a mix of boredom and bravado he knew too well. He adjusted his cap, tugging it low over his eyes, and walked inside. The German Shepherd lay there, a broken figure in the center of it all, surrounded by people who'd already written him off. Mason stood at the back, his hands in his pockets, watching, waiting. And when the auctioneer's desperate call went unanswered, when the laughter peaked, he made his choice. The chair scraped as he stood, his voice cutting through the din. "I'll take him." In that moment, Mason Carter wasn't just saving a dog. He was reaching for something he'd lost, something he didn't even know he could find again. The fluorescent lights of the Lincoln County auction barn buzzed like a swarm of restless bees, casting a cold, unfeeling glow over the concrete floor. In the center of it all lay the German Shepherd, a shadow of what he'd once been. His body was still, too still, as if he'd surrendered to the weight of the world pressing down on him. Up close, the scars told a story louder than words, jagged slashes across his flanks, a deep gouge above his left eye, patches of fur missing where something cruel had left its mark. His coat, once a rich tapestry of black and tan, was now a dull, patchy gray, clinging to a frame so gaunt you could count the ribs beneath it. He wasn't just thin, he was hollowed out, a shell where a warrior used to stand. Mason Carter stood a few feet away, his hands still in the pockets of his faded army jacket, watching the dog with a quiet intensity. The crowd had thinned out after the bid, ranchers and bargain hunters drifting toward the next lot, their voices fading into a distant hum. But Mason stayed, rooted to the spot, his hazel eyes tracing every inch of the animal he'd just claimed. This wasn't a pet store puppy or a farm dog bred to chase cattle. This was a soldier, a military canine who'd walked through fire and come back broken. Mason knew that look, the vacant stare, the way the ears barely flickered at the noise around him. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. The auctioneer, Hank, shuffled over, a worn leather leash dangling from his hand. "He's yours, mister," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with something softer, pity, maybe, or relief. "Paid the $200, signed the waiver, though I'd recommend a muzzle. He's been unpredictable." Hank hesitated, glancing at the dog as if waiting for it to prove him right. But the German Shepherd didn't move, didn't growl, didn't even acknowledge the leash now coiled on the floor beside him. His stillness wasn't calm, it was exhaustion, a kind of surrender that made Mason's stomach twist. From the corner of the room, a woman stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the concrete. She was in her late 30s, with sharp green eyes and a tangle of auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. Dr. Emily Harper had been a fixture in Missoula for years, a veterinarian known for patching up strays and calming spooked horses. She'd been watching the auction from the sidelines, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line as the bids, or lack of them, unfolded. She'd seen the dog before, tracked his case through whispers and paperwork she couldn't fully access. Now, as she approached, her gaze flickered between the German Shepherd and the man who'd saved him. "He's been here 3 weeks, she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a bitter edge. "Won't let anyone touch him, barely eats. They've been calling him Zero, because that's what they think he's worth." She nodded toward the auction staff, who were already busy with a rusted plow at the other end of the barn. "His records are a mess, incomplete. Military sent him here after whatever broke him. I tried to step in, but the bureaucracy's a brick wall." She paused, studying Mason. "You sure you know what you're taking on?" Mason didn't answer right away. He crouched down, slow and deliberate, keeping a good 6 feet between him and the dog. The German Shepherd's muscles tensed, subtle, but there, a ripple beneath the scarred skin. His ears flattened slightly, a warning born of instinct, but his eyes shifted, locking onto Mason's for the first time. They were dark, almost black, and deep with something raw. Pain, yes, but also a flicker of awareness, like a soldier scanning for threats. Mason held that gaze, unflinching. "Hey, pal," he said, his voice low and soft, the same tone he'd used with his horses, or once, with a wounded buddy in the field. "I'm Mason. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's eyes flickered, just for a second, a brief spark cutting through the dullness. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. Mason stayed still, his training kicking in. Never rush, never force, never show fear. He'd worked with military dogs before, back in Afghanistan. He knew their signals, their limits, the way they could read you better than you read yourself. This one wasn't aggressive, not in the way Hank had warned. He was guarded, locked behind walls built from whatever hell he'd been through. Dr. Harper stepped closer, her hands in the pockets of her denim jacket. "He's got scars that aren't from combat," she said, her tone dropping to a near whisper. "Not all of them, anyway. Look at his neck, those marks, too uniform, too deliberate. Someone did that to him, and not in a war zone." She shook her head, frustration creasing her brow. "Military dogs are supposed to retire with honor, not end up like this. Whatever happened, it's darker than service wounds." Mason nodded, his jaw tightening as he took in the vet's words. He saw it now, the faint circular welts around the dog's neck, the kind that might come from a collar yanked too hard, too often. His fists clenched in his pockets, but he kept his voice steady. "They're wrong about you," he said to the dog, ignoring the waiver still crumpled in Hank's hand. "Zero's not your name. We'll find you a better one." He didn't move closer, didn't push. He just waited, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. Dr. Harper watched him, her sharp eyes softening with a mix of hope and concern. She'd seen plenty of broken things, animals and people alike, but this was different. Mason wasn't some bleeding heart do-gooder or a rancher looking for a guard dog. There was a heaviness to him, a quiet resolve that matched the German shepherd's own stillness. Could this man, carrying his own scars, help this dog climb out of the abyss? Or would they just pull each other deeper into the dark? She didn't know, but something told her this wasn't a random crossing of paths. The paperwork took less than 15 minutes. No questions, no background check, just a signature on a liability form Mason scribbled without reading. The ease of it churned his gut. A military hero sold off like a busted chair. No dignity, no fight. Hank handed over the leash, stepping back as if glad to be rid of the burden. "Good luck," he muttered, already turning away. Mason picked up the leash, its leather cracked and faded, and looked down at the dog. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly. The German shepherd didn't rise, but his head tilted, just enough to show he'd heard. Mason decided right then, he'd call him Ghost, not for the name they'd given him, but for the way he seemed to hover between worlds, waiting for someone to call him back. The Lincoln County auction barn faded into a gray smudge in Mason Carter's rearview mirror as he guided his old pickup down the winding road toward home. The cab was silent, save for the low rumble of the engine and the faint creak of the worn leather leash coiled on the seat beside him. In the back, tucked against the tailgate, lay the German shepherd, Ghost, his scarred body curled tight, eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the truck bed. Mason kept glancing at him through the cracked side mirror, half expecting the dog to bolt at the first stop. But Ghost stayed still, a statue carved from war and weariness, his breath barely stirring the cold February air. Getting him into the truck had been a battle of patience. Back at the barn, Mason had approached slow and steady, the leash loose in his hand, his voice a murmur of calm. "Come on, pal, let's go home." Ghost hadn't budged, his muscles tensing like coiled wire, ears pinned back in warning. The auction staff had hovered nearby, muttering about muzzles and sedation, but Mason waved them off. He'd sat on the concrete, 6 feet away, talking quietly about the ranch. Open fields, quiet mornings, the horses that might not mind a new shadow. An hour passed, then nearly 2. The crowd long gone, the barn's lights flickering out one by one. Finally, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of purple, Ghost had taken a single, tentative step toward him, not trusting, not yet, but willing. It was enough. Now, pulling up to the ranch, Mason killed the engine and stepped out into the chill. The house loomed ahead, its chipped paint glowing faintly in the last light. The barn a dark silhouette against the mountains. He'd prepared a spot for Ghost, an old stall in the barn, lined with fresh straw, a bowl of water set out like an offering. But when he opened the tailgate and gestured toward it, leash in hand, Ghost didn't move. His eyes locked on the barn's shadowed doorway, and a tremor ran through him, subtle at first, then a full quake, his legs shaking as if the straw held ghosts of its own. Mason froze, reading the signs. "Not a fan of tight spaces, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than the dog. He dropped the leash, letting it thud softly into the dirt. "All right, we'll do this your way." The night unfurled under a sky thick with stars, the kind of vast Montana canopy that could make a man feel small or free, depending on the day. Mason settled on the porch steps, his army jacket pulled tight against the wind, a thermos of coffee steaming in his hands. Ghost stayed near the fence line, a careful 10 yards away, his silhouette sharp against the moonlit grass. He didn't lie down, didn't relax, just stood there, trembling faintly, eyes darting between Mason and the dark edges of the property. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his head snap up, alert and haunted. Mason watched him, sipping his coffee, letting the silence stretch. He didn't sleep either. The night felt too alive, too fragile, to close his eyes. Dawn broke slow and golden, the mountains catching the first rays like a promise. Mason's breath fogged in the crisp air as he stood, stretching the ache from his bones. Ghost hadn't touched the food he'd left out, a bowl of kibble mixed with scraps of beef from last night's dinner, still sitting untouched by the porch. The dog hadn't moved much either, just shifted a few feet closer during the night, his eyes never leaving Mason for long. It was then that Dr. Emily Harper's truck rattled up the gravel drive, kicking up a plume of dust that glittered in the morning light. She stepped out, her vet bag slung over her shoulder, her green eyes scanning the scene. "How'd it go?" she asked, nodding toward Ghost as she approached. Mason rubbed the back of his neck, his voice hoarse from hours of quiet vigil. "We're adjusting." She crouched near the untouched bowl, frowning. "He's not eating. Not a bite?" Mason shook his head. "Not yet. Didn't like the barn either. Started shaking when I got him near it." Emily's gaze softened as she studied Ghost, who tensed at her presence but didn't retreat. "That's not just stubbornness," she said, her tone clinical but laced with concern. "Look at him. See how he flinches when I move this?" She gestured with her bag, and Ghost's ears flattened, his body shrinking back a fraction. She stood, keeping her distance, her hands resting on her hips. "This isn't fear-aggression, Mason. It's trauma. Whatever they did to him, it wasn't just war, that reaction. I'd bet it's tied to medical stuff, tools maybe, or hands that hurt more than they helped." She glanced at the barn, then back at Ghost. "Confinement's a trigger too. 3 weeks at the auction, locked in a pen, probably didn't help. He's been running on empty, physically, emotionally. You're starting from scratch with him." Mason nodded, his jaw tight as he absorbed her words. He'd seen trauma before, in soldiers, in himself, but seeing it in Ghost hit different. Those scars, the way he braced for pain that wasn't coming, it was a mirror he hadn't expected. "He's not empty," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "Just lost, like I was." Emily tilted her head, studying him now, as much as the dog. "Maybe," she said after a beat, "but you've got a long road ahead. He won't let me near him yet. Tried yesterday, and he nearly took my hand off. You're the only one he hasn't snapped at." Mason crouched again, keeping that careful 6-foot buffer. "Hey, Ghost," he murmured, the name settling into place like it had always belonged. "We're in this together, all right? No rush, no chains. Just you and me figuring it out." Ghost's head tilted, just a fraction, his dark eyes catching the sunlight, a flicker of something alive beneath the haze. He didn't come closer, didn't wag his tail, but he didn't pull away either. It was small, almost nothing, but to Mason, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had been up too long. Emily watched them, her arms crossed against the morning chill. "That's a start," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "A damn small one, but a start." She climbed back into her truck, pausing before shutting the door. "Call me if he eats or if he doesn't. We'll get him through this." The engine sputtered to life, and she was gone, leaving Mason and Ghost alone again. The ranch stretched out around them, vast and quiet, a blank slate for whatever came next. Mason sat back on the steps, coffee gone cold, and looked at Ghost. "One step at a time, buddy," he said, and for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't the only one taking it. The days after the auction blurred into a quiet standoff at the ranch. Mason Carter moved through his routine, coffee at dawn, tending the horses, watching Ghost from a distance. But the German Shepherd remained a wary shadow, hovering near the fence line, never straying too close. He'd eat now, a few tentative bites of kibble when Mason wasn't looking, but the bowl stayed half full, the beef scraps untouched. Every attempt to approach, slow, steady, hands empty, met the same response: a low growl or a shrink into himself, ears flat, eyes wild with something deeper than fear. Mason didn't push. He'd seen that look in soldiers, the kind who'd survived too much to trust again. Time, he figured, was the only bridge they'd cross together. But time ran out that evening when the sky over Montana turned restless. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of rain, as dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, swallowing the sunset whole. Mason stood on the porch, thermos in hand, watching the horizon churn. Ghost paced near the pasture, his scarred frame taut, head twitching at every gust of wind. The first rumble of thunder was distant, a low growl echoing off the peaks, but it hit Ghost like a gunshot. His body froze, then shuddered, a tremor ripping through him, as if the sound had torn open an old wound. Mason set the thermos down, his own pulse quickening. He knew that flinch, the way a noise could drag you back to hell. Then the storm broke. A crack of thunder split the sky, sharp and deafening, and Ghost exploded into motion. He bolted, crashing into the wooden fence with a force that splintered the rail, blood streaking his shoulder where the jagged edge bit deep. His paws scrambled in the dirt, eyes wide and unseeing, as he tore across the ranch, a dark blur against the flashing lightning. Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and ran after him, boots pounding the wet earth, rain stinging his face. "Ghost!" he shouted, voice lost in the wind. But the dog didn't slow, driven by a panic Mason couldn't reach. The chase stretched across the property, past the barn, through the tall grass, toward the wooded edge where the land dipped into a ravine. Rain soaked through Mason's clothes, mud sucking at his boots, but he kept going, tracking Ghost's frantic path by the flashes of his scarred coat in the storm's electric glow. 2 miles out, he found him, trapped in a drainage ditch, its steep bank slick with runoff. Ghost thrashed against the mud, claws digging for traction, his growls turning to whimpers as thunder roared again. He was cornered, terrified, a soldier reliving a battlefield Mason couldn't see. Mason slid down the bank, landing hard in the muck, rain pelting his face. He didn't try to grab Ghost, knew better than that. Instead, he sat, knees drawn up, 6 feet away, rainwater pooling around him. "I know what it's like," he said, voice soft but firm, cutting through the storm's howl. "When the thunder sounds like mortars, when every shadow's a threat. I've been there, buddy. Nights where you can't trust anything because trust got people killed." Ghost's ears twitched, his head snapping toward Mason, eyes still wild but fixed on him now. Lightning lit the ditch, casting their shadows long and jagged, 2 figures caught in the same tempest. Mason kept talking, words spilling out like a lifeline. "I lost guys over there. Good guys. Every loud bang takes me back, makes me think I could have done more. But you can't live there forever, in that place where everything hurts. I've tried. You don't win that fight alone." Rain streamed down his face, mixing with mud, but he didn't move, didn't break eye contact. Ghost trembling slowed, his breaths heaving, hot and ragged in the cold air. The thunder rolled again, softer now, and he didn't bolt, just flinched, paws sinking deeper into the ditch. Hours passed, the storm raging then quieting, its fury bleeding into a steady drizzle. Mason's voice grew hoarse, his jacket heavy with water, but he stayed. Ghost stayed too, watching him, the wildness in his eyes dimming to something else. Confusion, maybe, or exhaustion. As the first light of dawn crept through the clouds, painting the mountains in faint gold, Ghost took a step. Just one. Tentative, his claws scraping the mud. Then another. He didn't come close enough to touch, still kept that wary distance, but he moved toward Mason, head low, ears flicking forward. Mason stood, slow and careful, his legs stiff from the cold. "Come on, pal," he said, voice cracking with fatigue. "Let's go home." Ghost didn't follow right away, but when Mason started back, he trailed behind, 10 feet, then 8, a shadow pacing a shadow. The ranch came into view, soaked and silent, the horses nickering softly from the barn. Ghost stopped at the fence line, watching Mason climb the porch steps. He didn't come closer, didn't cross that final gap. But he didn't run either. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. A crack in the armor, a first step across a chasm neither had built. Mason sank onto the steps, rain dripping from his cap, and looked out at Ghost. The dog stood there, mud-streaked and bloodied, but alive, still fighting, even if he didn't know it. "We're gonna be okay," Mason murmured, more to himself than the dog. For the first time since Afghanistan, he almost believed it. A week had passed since the storm, and the ranch had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The Montana air carried the sharp bite of late February, the grass still damp from the rain, glistening under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. Mason Carter moved through his days with a quiet purpose, coffee on the porch, tending the horses, watching Ghost from the corner of his eye. The German shepherd had edged closer since that night in the ditch, not much, but enough. He'd linger near the porch now, 10 feet instead of 20, his scarred frame less rigid, his dark eyes tracking Mason's every move. He'd even started eating more, slow, cautious bites when he thought no one noticed. But trust was still a distant star, flickering just out of reach. That morning, Mason was in the barn, mucking stalls, the familiar scrape of the pitchfork grounding him. Ghost lay just outside the open door, sprawled in a patch of weak sunlight, his head resting on his paws. It was progress, small, fragile, but real. The horses nickered softly, unbothered by the dog's presence, their calm a quiet contrast to the tension still coiled in his frame. Mason paused, leaning on the pitchfork, watching him. "You're starting to fit in, pal," he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Ghost's ears flicked forward, but he didn't lift his head, just held Mason's gaze, steady and unreadable. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the moment. Dr. Emily Harper's truck rolled up the drive, dust swirling in its wake, and she stepped out with a thick manila envelope tucked under her arm. Her face was grim, green eyes shadowed with something heavy. Mason set the pitchfork aside and met her on the porch, Ghost rising slowly to follow, keeping his distance but staying close. "Got something for you," Emily said, her voice low as she handed him the envelope. Military finally coughed up some records. Took a friend pulling strings, but it's his, your dog's. Mason's hand stilled on the envelope, the weight of it sinking into his palms. He tore it open, pulling out a stack of papers stamped with official seals, faded reports, redacted lines, and a grainy photo of a German shepherd in tactical gear, ears perked, eyes sharp. "His real name's Titan," Emily said, leaning against the porch rail. "Deployed with the army in Afghanistan. 3 combat tours, special operations. Highly decorated too. Saved lives, took down targets, the works." She paused, her gaze shifting to Titan, now Ghost, who watched them from the bottom of the steps. But then something happened. There's a 6-month gap, nothing official, just blacked out pages. Next thing, he's off the books, dumped into that auction. Mason's breath caught as he scanned the documents. Training logs showed impossible hours, 20-hour days, relentless drills, no rest. His jaw tightened, fingers tracing a line about Ghost's last deployment. Kandahar, 2002. The date hit him like a bullet. "He was there," Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. "The day we lost half my unit." He looked up at Emily, then back at Ghost. Memories flooding in, dust and blood, the roar of an ambush, the weight of guilt he'd carried ever since. "I was on that mission, perimeter support. We couldn't stop it." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "He's got scars from more than combat, Mason. Look at this." She pulled out a medical report, pointing to notes about old wounds, slashes too precise, burns too uniform. "These aren't battlefield injuries. Someone hurt him after, systematically." Mason's hands shook as he read, rage simmering beneath his calm. Ghost's ears perked at his tone, and for the first time, he stepped closer. climbing one porch step, then stopping, as if sensing the shift. That afternoon, Emily stayed, insisting on a closer look. "We need to know more," she said, pulling a sedative from her bag. "There's something under his fur. Felt it when I got near him last time." Mason hesitated, then nodded, crouching beside Ghost. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, stroking the air near him, not touching. Ghost tensed but didn't pull away, his trust in Mason just enough to let Emily work. Under sedation, she shaved a patch on his neck, revealing a metal tag embedded in the skin, overgrown with scar tissue. She extracted it carefully, holding it up to the light. A military ID, numbers half worn, but one name clear. Handler, Major Daniel Pierce. Mason's face went pale. "Pierce?" His voice cracked, disbelief sharpening the edges. He was court-martialed, ethics violations, rumors of cruelty in the canine program. Discharged 3 years back. Everyone knew his name, methods so harsh they broke more than they trained. He stared at the tag, then at Ghost, pieces snapping into place. "He did this to you, didn't he?" Ghost stirred, groggy from the sedative, his eyes finding Mason's. For the first time, there was recognition there, not fear, not distance, but a spark of something shared, a silent acknowledgement of pain they both knew too well. Emily sat back, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Those missing 6 months? I'd bet Pierce was behind it. Off-the-books training, covering his tracks. Ghost's a witness to whatever went down." She glanced at Mason, her tone firm. "This isn't just a rescue anymore. Someone wanted him gone, forgotten. That tag proves it." Mason clenched the tag in his fist, the metal biting into his palm. "Not anymore," he said, voice low and resolute. "He's not disappearing, not while I'm here." Ghost shifted, rising unsteadily to his feet, and moved closer to the table where they sat. He didn't climb the rest of the steps, didn't fully close the gap, but he stayed, watching Mason with an intensity that hadn't been there before. The ranch stretched quiet around them, the mountains standing sentinel, but the air felt charged now, heavy with secrets unraveling. Mason looked at Ghost, then at the papers scattered across the table. "You were there that day," he said softly. "Trying to save them, same as me. We're not done fighting, are we?" The German shepherd's ears flicked forward, his scarred head tilting slightly. It wasn't an answer, not in words, but it was a promise. Whatever Major Pierce had done, whatever had broken Ghost and sent him to that auction, it wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something else, a reckoning, a redemption, a bond forged in the ashes of the past. And Mason knew, deep in his bones, he'd see it through. The Montana dawn broke crisp and clear, painting the ranch in shades of gold as the mountains stood watch. Mason Carter sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes fixed on Ghost. The German shepherd lay in the yard, caught in a restless sleep, legs twitching, soft whimpers escaping his throat, a soldier trapped in nightmares. Mason set the mug down and leaned forward, voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used in the field to calm a shaken squad mate. "You're safe now, buddy," he murmured. "It's just a dream. You're here, on the ranch. The war's over." Ghost's eyes snapped open, wild for a split second, then settled on Mason. Instead of bolting or growling, he stayed still, watching with an intensity that hadn't been there before, a fragile thread of trust weaving tighter. That quiet moment shattered when a car rolled up the gravel drive, dust swirling in the morning light. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes red-rimmed from tears she'd held too long. Lisa Monroe carried a worn leather satchel, her steps hesitant but determined. Ghost rose, ears perked, and approached her slowly, his tail low, not tucked, a cautious curiosity in his stride. Lisa froze on the porch, breath catching as he pressed his scarred head gently against her hand. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered, voice trembling. "John's dog." Mason's brow furrowed, but before he could ask, she sank to her knees, wrapping her arms around Ghost's neck. For the first time since the auction, the German shepherd didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, deliberate and careful, a soldier recognizing kin. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Lisa shared her story, her husband's satchel open between them. "John, Captain John Monroe, was my husband," she said, pulling out a stack of letters and a journal, pages yellowed and creased. "Last tour in Afghanistan, 2002. He wrote about Ghost, called him the bravest damn dog he'd ever seen. Saved 3 of his men in Kandahar before. Her voice broke, and she handed Mason a letter. Before the ambush took him. Mason's hands shook as he read, John's words painting a vivid scene. Ghost breaking free from his handler, charging toward the unit, warning them seconds before the attack hit. He took shrapnel shielding them, Lisa continued. John was gathering evidence, something about the canine program going wrong, dogs disappearing. Then he was gone. Mason looked at Ghost, sprawled by the door now, ears tracking every word. Major Pierce, he said, the name bitter on his tongue. He ran that program, punished Ghost for saving lives, not breaking them. Lisa nodded, pulling a photo from the journal, a younger Ghost in tactical gear, proud and alert, beside a smiling John. Pierce labeled him unstable, shipped him off. I didn't know he'd survived until I heard about your auction story in town. She wiped her eyes, voice steadying. John would have fought for him. I'm here to finish that. The ranch hummed with new energy after Lisa's visit. Word of Ghost's past spreading like wildfire through Missoula's veteran community. But the quiet didn't last. 3 days later, a black SUV rolled up the drive, its engine cutting through the afternoon stillness. 2 men in crisp civilian clothes stepped out, their smiles too smooth, their eyes too sharp. "Mr. Carter," one said, voice slick as oil. "We're with a private security firm. Heard you acquired a retired military dog. We'd like to buy him. Name your price." Ghost, lounging near the barn, rose instantly, a deep growl rumbling in his chest, not fear, but defiance, a soldier's warning honed by years of pain. Mason crossed his arms, stepping between them and Ghost. "He's not for sale," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "Private property. You're leaving. Now." The second man smirked, stepping closer. "Some dogs are too valuable to waste out here, Mr. Carter. Surely you get that." Ghost's growl deepened, teeth bared, and the men faltered, sensing something they couldn't control. "This isn't over," the first snapped, retreating to the SUV. "Major Pierce sends his regards." The name hung in the air as they peeled out, dust choking the silence. Mason knelt beside Ghost, meeting his steady gaze. "They won't touch you," he said, voice low and fierce. "Not while I'm breathing." Ghost held his look, ears flicking forward, a ghost of his military bearing returning, not forced, but chosen. That night, the community stirred. Mark Wilson, a Vietnam vet who ran the feed store, spread the tale at his counter, how Ghost's scars matched the loyalty of their old unit dogs. James Cooper, a retired Marine K-9 handler, drove 3 hours to see him, cane tapping as he recounted losing dogs to Pierce's brutality. "He's one of ours," James said, voice tight. "We don't let that bastard win." Sheriff Tom Hayes stopped by unannounced, his badge glinting in the porch light. "Heard about your visitors," he said, eyeing Ghost with respect. "Served 20 years myself. Our K-9s were family. This stops here." He promised patrols, deputies keeping watch on the access road. Even little Emma Lewis, the school principal's daughter, launched a Protect Ghost bake sale, her 9-year-old determination raising funds for his care. The ranch became a fortress of quiet resolve, veterans and townsfolk rallying around a dog they'd never met but somehow knew. Mason sat up late, Lisa's letters spread across the table, Ghost at his feet, closer than ever, head resting near his boots. "You saved them," he murmured, tracing John's words. "And they punished you for it. Sound familiar?" Ghost's eyes met his, clear and focused, reflecting not just trust, but partnership. Pierce's shadow loomed, but so did their strength. A team now, not just survivors. The fight wasn't coming, it was here. And for the first time since Kandahar, Mason felt ready. The Montana sky stretched wide and cold on the morning of Major Daniel Pierce's demonstration. A sprawling training facility outside Helena, humming with anticipation. Military brass, private contractors, and foreign buyers milled about, their polished shoes crunching gravel, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Mason Carter parked his truck behind a maintenance shed, Ghost at his side in a new tactical vest, courtesy of James Cooper, the old Marine handler who'd become their ally. The German Shepherd's scars stood out stark against the black fabric, but his posture was steady, eyes locked on the kennels ahead. 15 minutes, Mason said, adjusting his tie. a stranger's garb over his army jacket. "That's all we need, buddy." Ghost's ears flicked forward, a soldier ready for the mission. Inside, Pierce took the stage, his tailored suit gleaming under the lights, voice smooth as he touted his future of canine training. Behind him, handlers prepped dogs, sleek, obedient, their movements robotic. Mason and Ghost slipped through the crowd, guided by Doctor. Emily Harper's voice crackling through an earpiece from her van. "Security's tight. Stay low until it starts." Lisa Monroe, posing as a journalist, wove among the spectators, her camera hiding a transmitter feeding everything to an FBI contact, Agent Marcus Reynolds, waiting in the wings. Ghost's gaze sharpened as he caught a scent from the back kennels, nudging Mason toward them. "Something's off," Mason whispered. "Emily, check the feeds." Her reply came fast, urgent. "They're moving dogs out, sedated, headed for a van. Pierce is cleaning house." Mason and Ghost reached the kennel row just as two handlers loaded a limp German shepherd into a vehicle. "Stand down," Mason barked, his military tone cutting through. "Federal investigation in progress." The younger handler hesitated, lowering a tranquilizer gun. "Major's orders, retirement," he stammered, eyeing Ghost. "Wait, is that Titan? They said he was put down." Mason stepped forward, Ghost at his heels, tall and unbroken. "Check his ID. See what Pierce did to him." Pierce rounded the corner, flanked by security, his composure fracturing at the sight of Ghost. "Well, Mason," he sneered, recovering with a cold laugh. "I expected more flair." Mason met his gaze, unflinching. "No flair needed, just the truth. The dogs you broke, the lives you buried." Ghost stepped forward, sitting in perfect military form, proud, unshaken, living proof of Pierce's lies. The younger handler faltered, doubt creeping in. "Sir, what are we doing with these dogs?" The question hung, drawing eyes from the crowd now trickling toward the commotion. Agent Reynolds emerged, badge flashing. "Major Pierce, this is a federal investigation now." Lisa thrust forward, her folder spilling evidence. John's letters, training logs, Ghost's scars documented in photos. "My husband died exposing this," she said, voice ringing clear. "Abuse, cover-ups, dogs eliminated to hide it." Emily joined, medical reports in hand. "These animals were tortured, labeled unstable when they resisted." The younger handler stepped back, horrified, as Ghost stood between Pierce's men and the evidence, his growl a defiant shield. Phones recorded, whispers turned to outrage, and Pierce's empire cracked. Chaos erupted when Pierce pulled a shock device, the kind that had scarred Ghost's neck. Its high whine pierced the air, but Ghost didn't cower. He looked to Mason, waiting, then held his ground, a soldier choosing courage over fear. "He's not yours anymore," Mason said, voice quiet but ironclad. Pierce lunged, drawing a concealed gun, but Ghost moved faster, disarming him with precise force, years of training reborn in purpose. Military police swarmed in, cuffing Pierce as he snarled threats. "This isn't over," but his words drowned in the tide of justice. The sedated dogs were freed, Emily's team rushing to save them, each one a chance at Ghost's path. Days later, a fire broke out during a late-night kennel transfer, Pierce's last loyalist torching evidence. Two young shepherds remained trapped as flames roared. Ghost broke from Mason's side, plunging into the smoke. "Ghost!" Mason shouted, but he was gone, guiding the dazed dogs out before a beam collapsed, trapping him. He burst through a weakened wall, singed and gasping, collapsing yards from safety as the structure caved. Mason cradled him, rain mixing with soot on his face, as Emily worked frantically. "Don't give up," he whispered. "We heal together, remember?" The community transformed the veterinary clinic into a lifeline. Mark Wilson organized vigils, Emma Lewis's bake sale funded equipment. Sheriff Hayes posted guards. Veterans brought coffee, prayers filled the parking lot, and Ghost fought, his tail thumping weakly when Mason spoke. On the third day, his eyes cleared, breath steadying. "Look at them," Mason said, gesturing to the crowd outside. "All here for you, buddy." Emily smiled, tears in her eyes. "This is healing, community, loyalty, refusing to quit." Months later, the ranch became the Second Chance Sanctuary, a haven for military dogs and veterans. Ghost, graying but strong, guided new arrivals, his gentle nudge calming a trembling Belgian Malinois named Scout, who bonded with a PTSD-stricken Marine. Mason's method, trust over force, drew military attention, reforming canine programs nationwide. Pierce's trial exposed decades of abuse, his legacy dismantled. While ghosts grew, policies changed, dogs honored, their bond a blueprint for recovery. Sarah's outreach, Emily's research, and the annual Ghosts Run cemented their impact, a celebration of resilience. One autumn evening, Mason and Ghost sat on the porch, watching veterans and dogs arrive, scarred, hopeful, healing together. Ghost rested his head on Mason's knee, eyes wise and calm, a warrior who'd found peace. "You didn't just survive," Mason said softly. "You showed us how to live." Their story rippled beyond Montana, proving that from the deepest wounds, the strongest light could shine. Their journey reminds us that healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, it's hard, but it's possible. No matter how deep the wounds, there's always a chance to start again, to find someone who sees you when you can't see yourself. Mason and Ghost prove that even in our darkest hours, loyalty and courage can light the way back. So, here's the takeaway. Hold on to hope, fight for what matters, and never underestimate the power of a second chance. Whether it's for a dog, a soldier, or any of us walking through life's storms. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more tales like Mason and Ghost's, stories of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that lift us up. Leave a like, drop a comment with your thoughts or your city. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video where we'll uncover another journey worth sharing.